All right. Thank you for the introduction. So I have a triple screen setup, so that's why I kind of constantly keep moving here. So bear with me as I probably am looking in a weird place. But as Andrew introduced me, my name is Sri Lakshmi Suresh. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm a horticulture educator, and I'm a former bee researcher of about 10 years. And so I really love bees. I studied honeybees, but native bees are definitely one of my biggest passions. And so I'm lucky that I get to spend a lot of time talking about all bees and all pollinators. So it looks like we are right on the dot. So I'll go ahead and jump right in. All right. So, oh, there we are. Um, So, whenever I have a presentation about pollinators, about bees, I always kind of like to start talking about what pollination is, and get us all on the same page because there are plenty of people who have ideas of what pollination is. I often, if I have a live audience, I will ask for raised hands to tell me what they think pollination is. But to keep us all on the same playing field, I would define pollination as the transfer of pollen grains from the male anthers to the female stigma. So when you look at this little diagram I have of a flower at the right, we have the male parts of the flower, the andrecium in all, but we're really looking at the anther that produces the pollen. We want those pollen grains to go to the female part of the plant, into the stigma, the entire female part of the plant is called the gynecium. But really, what we're concerned about is that pollen going into the stigma and being able to pollinate a flower, because after we pollinate flowers, we'll get fruit and eventually we'll get seeds. So when we are talking about pollination, um, pollination is really important, but there's a lot of things that pollination is not. Um, and pollination is not something that is harmful to a plant. It has nothing to do necessarily with seed dispersal. If you think of, say, a deer eating an apple, pooping out the apple seeds, and there's an apple tree, that's great. That's super important for spreading apple trees, but that's nothing to do with pollination. And so when I talk about pollination and having that broad um, definition of what pollination is, I define pollinators as organisms that then facilitate the transfer of pollen grains from the male anthers to the female stigma. And that is a very kind of open ended way to define pollinators, and that's on purpose because. Again, we're really only concerned about moving that pollen grain from one part of the flower to another part. And however that happens, whatever organism facilitates that would technically count as a pollinator. So some of our common pollinators here are bees, beetles, flies, butterflies. People also know bats, birds, lizards as pollinators. Um, but also using such a kind of broad definition of pollinators would also include us humans when we are doing hand pollination. If you've ever worked in a greenhouse or you've worked in plant propagation, you might have taken your little paintbrush here and tapped it along the anther of a plant and moved it to another desirable plant and done hand pollination. And so that would count. Um, that said, that doesn't mean that that's the most effective or most common way pollination takes place. And it's not the most effective way that pollinators might pollinate, which gets into the point what makes an effective pollinator? Because there's definitely pollinators who are a cut above the rest. And spoiler alert, you're here, so you can probably guess that I'll tell you it's bees. Bees are the best, most effective pollinators, but there are particular reasons why. Um, so Many organisms visit plants. There's plenty of organisms we see flying around, trying to get nectar. So that's that kind of sweet, sugary syrup that a flower produces to try to attract an organism. Um, but again, only a few are efficient pollinators. So let's do a thought experiment where we're pretending to be a flower. So, if we're a flower and we are hoping to be pollinated to be able to produce seeds, um, as a flower, we hope that a pollinator comes along. And we hope that that pollinator trying to get our nectar will hopefully rub against the anthers and hopefully we'll get some pollen on them. And hopefully this pollinator will then fly to a different flower, but of the same species. And hopefully that pollen that hopefully stuck onto that insect will hopefully then fall off and hopefully go into the stigma of that different flower from the same species. And so I used a lot of hopes and hopefullys, and that was on purpose because there can be a lot of chance involved in pollination. But there are ways to increase odds of pollination. Um, Anatomy and behavior can increase those chances, and that is some of the things that bees do quite well. And I always jokingly say bees have the best hair. They have the most luscious locks of all of the pollinators. Yes, this is my personal opinion, but also if we think of efficacy of pollination, it's kind of true. And that is because they have really good hair for collecting pollen. And I have this diagram here on the right. So when we're looking here, these are all different drawings of bee hairs. And if we look, some of these are pretty long, but a lot of these you can see kind of look like a feather. And so, if any of you have ever had, say, a long haired dog or a long haired cat, or maybe you are a long haired human, if you've ever instead also had a short haired dog or a short haired cat or a short haired human, that shorter hair, that less amount of hair, cleaner, um, and it doesn't catch as much stuff. Bees have long hair and they also have very dense hair that's branched like a feather. So when they come along to these flowers, and they're collecting pollen, they're collecting nectar. These branches that kind of make it look like a feather, these hairs make it really, really efficient and likely that pollen will actually cling onto these hairs. And in many cases, bees have special pollen collecting hairs where they can actually work to pack pollen onto those hairs. Um, and of course, with biology, there's always an exception to every rule. And so I have an asterisk for most because there are, of course, some cuckoo bees and male bees that do not collect pollen. And so, in talking about bees, they evolved from wasps about 125 million years ago, which means bees are essentially vegetarian wasps. They get their entire kind of nutrition from a flower. They're eating the pollen and the nectar, and they are happy and on their way. Of course, there's exceptions to everything. They will sometimes supplement their diets with something else for very particular species we do not have here in Illinois. Uh, but in general, they've really got everything they need in flowers. And the 125 million years ago is something that I think is a really cool fact because the rise of angiosperms or flowering plants also occurred about 125 million years ago. So when we start to see flowering plants enter the fossil record, that's also when we start to see bees. They really have evolved right alongside flowers and have become incredibly efficient at doing what they do. So there are actually 20,000 bee species globally, which is probably a lot more than people would guess. And this is always my absolute favorite part. Maybe we can get a little chat participation. I would like you to toss in the chat, how many bee species do you think live here in Illinois? I'll give you maybe 30 seconds. Give me your best guess. How many bee species do you think live here in Illinois? Okay, 100, 1,000, 10, 12, 90. Oh, okay. Oh, we have a winner. Someone said 500, and that is the correct number. So we have 500 different species of bees in Illinois. So the folks that were around 4,000 to 5,000, that's how many species we have kind of in North America. So right number, wrong geographic scale. So we have a lot of bees, and that means there are many, many more bees than just the honeybee. And so another misconception I want to correct before we kind of talk more about the different bee families and different kinds of bees is that a lot of people assume that bees all live in hives, and that is not true. The vast majority of bees actually are solitary, meaning they live alone by themselves. And most of them are actually ground nesters. So most of these images in this presentation are my own, unless they have a credit. I think there's only 3 or 4 that I have credited and are not my own, because being a huge nerd, I love bees and I'm always taking photos of them out in the wild. So here, this is a Colides inequalis, the unequal cellophane bee. They are a ground nester, and here is another Colides bee, and it is also a ground nester. They kind of look like they live in little anthills. You'll see them. These both are kind of very early spring species. And one thing that I want to note, even though most bees are solitary and most are ground nesters, turn this laser pointer off. There are also these twig nesting bees. So if you've seen those bee hotels, that's kind of what they are trying to encourage for those twig nesting bees. So this is a diagram of a cross section. Oh, and my credit on that didn't appear. Let's see here. There we are. This is a lovely diagram from How to Manage a Successful Bee Hotel, which is a resource from NC State Extension, developed by Dr. Elsa Youngstead and Meredith Favre. It's completely free. You can download it as a PDF. Highly recommend it. And so to kind of explain how these twig nesting bees are, if we have this, say, we can pretend that this is perhaps a flower that you've left in your garden over the winter. It's dead, but the head of the flower is still standing. Maybe you've cut off the flower head, but the stalk is still there. You've got a good 18 inches. So a bee goes in there, and so it's the female bee who creates nests. Again, the exception, those male bees and those cuckoo bees are nest parasites. So they are not making their own nests. They are taking the hard work of someone else and doing their best to piggyback off of that. Male bees tend to just kind of clasp onto a stem. They will kind of hunker down elsewhere. These female bees are building a nest for their offspring. So this bee will go all the way down into a tube. Or into this twig, if we're pretending this is an 18-inch, say, coneflower stem. She goes all the way in there, kind of chews her way down, and she'll make a little partition. And then she'll start to collect all of her pollen, her nectar, kind of mix that pollen and nectar up so it makes a nice little sticky ball. Puts it together as a care package and lays a nice egg. Then she'll go out and then she'll come back and make another partition. And she'll rinse and repeat the process. So here in this diagram on the left, there's a cocoon. And that is representing that this is the oldest egg that was laid. It's the most developmentally close to adulthood here because it's the oldest. So this is the um, oldest bee, and then here's the second oldest, and so on and so on. And so, what's really interesting about this, you might be wondering, well, how does the and so the answer is these bees, that first bee here will kind of chew out of the partition and emerge. But the amazing thing about bees is that they know kind of when and where to lay which sacks of eggs. So these first kind of early to emerge on the outside are going to be males. Female bees are going to take longer to develop. And so those are going to be those first eggs laid at the end of this nest because they need more time to develop. And so when we think about bee hotels, they are very cool. But I always tell folks if you want a set it and forget it kind of a way to promote bees in your landscapes, a bee hotel is not always the best choice because there is a lot of maintenance that goes into it and a lot of research that you need to do to have a successful bee hotel. These cavity nesters, oftentimes the different species of bees, they will need a very specific diameter of hole to be able to nest in there. And when I say very specific, if it's off by even 1 millimeter, so that is I did the math, okay, it was 3/64 of an inch if you want to use the English system, or 1 millimeter off, then bees may not develop successfully. That's only talking about the diameter. If the length, if it's too short of a hole, that means the bee has wasted time, maybe can only lay 3 or 4 eggs, and maybe they're all males and has to go spend her time making another nest somewhere that has a longer tube. Doesn't mean that longer is better though, because when you have a longer tube, sometimes it takes too long for that oldest female bee at the very back here to even emerge. So you have to be very careful, and every species has different requirements. So if you're trying to attract different species of these cavity nesting bees, you're going to need to have different lengths, different diameters, and different kind of holes for all of this. And of course, with any bee hotel, maintenance and cleaning these resources is key. I always joke that you wouldn't want to go to an Air B and B and they just never change the sheets. Imagine if you go in and there's this beautiful bed, but you're like, wait a second, someone's used tissue is on there. Um, or someone has like clearly sneezed on the end. That would be really gross. And so when people have bee hotels and they're not sanitizing them annually, that's essentially what you're doing. You're creating a space for not only bacteria and fungi to develop, um, these bees are not necessarily going to be in those kind of dense um, spaces in nature. And so you're probably doing a great job of creating uh, a little bird feeding station that you probably didn't want to be a bird feeder because everyone loves to eat bee larvae. They're delicious. They're full of protein, they're full of fat. Every bird wants to eat them, and so do a lot of wasps or other predatory insects. So I always tell folks if you want to attract native bees to your yard, if you want to make sure they have nesting material, the best thing you can really do is plant native plants. There are some of our cavity nesting bees that won't even go to a bee hotel, even if you provide the right size hole, because they really do need to drill their own stems into that pith. So again, that is How to Manage a Successful Bee Hotel, a free resource from NC State Extension. And it talks about all of that in more detail. And if you decide you do want to do a bee hotel, but you want to make sure yours is safe and sanitary, that is an excellent resource. Um, One more misconception: save the bees. So, a lot of people will say save the bees, knowing that they're important pollinators. But in recent years, there's been kind of a disconnect or some arguments cropping up between honeybees and native bees. I see someone in the chat pointed out that honeybees are not native, and that is true. So when people say save the bees, a lot of times I notice that people are having multiple conversations. People might be trying to talk about conservation. Some people might be trying to talk about agriculture. So honeybees are the European honeybee, Apis mellifera. Um, was brought over just 400 years ago by European colonizers to pollinate the crops that they also brought over. And so now we have many million people here in the US, and we have a lot of food that we reliably like to eat. And so honeybees are really crucial pollinators for the foods that we eat and that we have. And most people have heard, perhaps, that about 1 in every 3 bites of food comes from a pollinator or comes from a bee. And that is true. A lot of those will be pollinated by honeybees, those exotic fruits and vegetables you see in the grocery store. And exotic refers to things like apples. Apples are actually native to Asia. Um, and so when you think of a lot of the stuff we get in our grocery store, they're not native to this area. And so honeybees were brought over, and they are really crucial to our agricultural systems as domesticated livestock. And domesticated livestock is really talking about a very specific evolutionary process and genetic process. Humans have been keeping honeybees for about 9,000 years. So we have really selected for specific traits with them, and they are different from our native bees. Native bees have had time or millions of years to co evolve with the plants that we have naturally in our Illinois habitat. And one more thing that I want to establish as a baseline, having been a honeybee researcher, there is a term that we kind of talk about as the 4 Ps. And these are issues that affect honeybees, but they really affect a lot of the bees because the vast majority of bees that we have here that you're likely to see out and about are going to be in the family Apidae, which means they're pretty closely related to honeybees. So things that affect honeybees will naturally kind of affect the other bees as well. And even the other families of bees are still kind of have a similar kind of anatomy behavior that a lot of times these 4 Ps will still affect our native bees too. And so those 4 Ps that we worry about are poor forage, pesticides, pests, and pathogens. Poor forage being that there's just not much food. So if we dial the clock back to 1840, there used to be over 22 million acres of prairie in the state of Illinois. Does anyone have any guesses as to how many acres of prairie we have here in Illinois now? I will look to the chat. Give me your guess as to how many acres we have today in 2025. How many acres of prairie do we have in Illinois? In 1840, it was 22 million acres. What is the number today? Less than 2 million is correct. Oh, it looks like we have a winner. Someone said 2,200. That's about right. The estimate is right now around 2,000, 2,500 acres of prairie. So that is not much, meaning that there isn't much food for our native bees. There isn't much food for honeybees. There isn't much food for a lot of our native organisms here. And so if people ask me for my personal and professional opinion about what is maybe the worst of the 4 Ps, I would personally say poor forage because there just really isn't any food to be had. So when you're planting a native plant, that's something that kind of all of these organisms in our native environment can utilize and use. So I'm going to go ahead and start talking about bee identification, which is what you're all here for. One quick photo disclaimer, being all of my photos, I have been studying bees for many years. I do want to note there are photos like in the top right corner of me holding a bee. Please do not pick up bees unless you are a trained professional for your own safety. I know how to safely, for both me and the bee, hold and handle bees. Do not do this in your personal lives, please. But going to talk about bee families. So there's 7 of them globally. So there's going to be many other or animals that have many families. Bees just have the 7. And so those 7 families are Melitidae, Apidae, Megacylidae, Andrenidae, Halictidae, Callididae, and Stenotrididae. And don't worry, I'm going to talk about them and give you their common names in a couple slides here. But I just want to note that we are not going to talk about Melitidae and Stenotrididae today. And that is because there's only 2 genera of Melitidae here in Illinois, and you cannot actually identify them to that bee family without a microscope. So you won't really see or be able to identify those bees out in the wild. And the Stenotrididae family is only in Australia. So if you've ever seen a nice photo of a blue banded bee, yes, they do exist. There are some bees that are bright blue. They sadly only exist in Australia. So someday I really hope that I will fulfill my life dream to go see one of these blue banded bees because they do look really cool. So one note about the melitids that we're not talking about today, that is actually one of the most ancestral or oldest orders of bee families. Taxonomic trees, like I have on the right here, are kind of complicated and tricky to read. But I just wanted to kind of have that illustrate how these families are related to each other. And so I kind of had this ordered. I'll press back here. I have these ordered kind of as the most ancestral, being melitid, to the most kind of new bee is the stenotridids. And so I will be talking about the evolutionary order from the oldest to newest bee in this presentation. And this is from a paper that is called the Bee Tree of Life and is much more information than any of you need to know. But if you're interested, you should be able to pull that available on PubMed, which should be free to access for everyone. So, getting right into it, we're all here to talk about bees. The apids. These are the bees that we are familiar with. Many of them have really fluffy hair. These are the bees that you think of when you think of a bee. Many of them are medium to a larger size, so they're very easy to see. So our bumblebees, our honeybees, our carpenter bees, our sunflower bees, our squash bees, those are all apids. So I have here one of our longhorn bees. Oh, my laser pointer turned off. Here is one of our beautiful longhorn bees. In the top right-hand corner, I have a beautiful sunflower bee. In the bottom left, I have one of our Melisodes. Longhorn bee, that's a female, so it doesn't look quite as longhorned. And longhorned is really referring to those antennae. Not technically horns, but that's what you get out of common names. They kind of mean whatever they mean. Scientific names will never change, however. And then this little cutie here, which again, please do not pick up bees with your bare hands unless you are a trained professional. That is Xenoglossa pruinosa, or the squash bee. So if you are a fan of pumpkins, making jack-o'-lanterns or pumpkin pie, you can thank a squash bee for that. They are the most efficient and effective pollinators of pumpkins, cucumbers, zucchini, and all of those cucurbits. Honeybees will pollinate, but you really need squash bees to be able to do a good job. And for some reference, here in Illinois, we have about 85 or so species of apids, of so bees in the family Apidae. And I just want to note only 15 to 20 of them are bumblebees and honeybees. So that means that of the 500 bees we have in Illinois, only about 4% of them really live in those big colonies with several hundred bees. The rest of them are kind of sticking it out on their own. All right. So megakylids. Megakylidae is the leafcutter bee family, and this is my personal favorite. These guys have very large mandibles, and that is so that they can chew or cut those leaves, as you could guess, having a common name of a leafcutter bee. And they also have hair on the underside of their abdomen. So you can hopefully sort of see. I tried to blow up this photo a little bit. Oh, my laser pointer is off again. There we are. You can sort of see there's some fuzz there. So instead of having those pollen collecting hairs or scopy on the back of the legs, these family of bees have it on the underside of their abdomen. So that means they have really fuzzy butts. And so all of these guys on the undersides of their abdomens have those fuzzy butts. But my favorite thing about them, other than them being very small, is that they use those leaves to line their nests. So when we think back to that slide, I had that cross section of a bee nest. They are using leaves to help partition those little sections of their nest. So not only do they have fuzzy butts, these bees live in leaf blankets. And personally, I don't think you could get any better than that. Um, so uh, other than me loving leafcutter bees, here we have a Inthidium, a wool carder bee. And you might see those on if you have any lamb's ears plants, things that are fuzzy. They like to sleep in fuzzy, soft down. And so they will collect that. Here is one of our alfalfa bees, I believe. I am uncertain of this species, and this is actually a photo I took in Pennsylvania at Penn State's pollinator research area. And this is, I think, a Hyriades carneata, which is I think it's an armored carnate bee. Do not quote me on the common name, though. Uh, and so, one note, there are some megakylids that are kind of important for commercial pollination. Specifically, we think of osmia or orchard bees. There is the blue orchard bee that people might have seen being used in apple orchards or other kind of orchards, and they are very efficient native pollinators. There is Osmia cornifrons, or the horn-faced mason bee. I wrote down the common name for that one. And that is actually an introduced pollinator from Asia. And they do really well in kind of humid weather. And so that's why they were brought over as a pollinator like the honeybee was. The Anthidium wool carder bees, the Inthidium oblongatum, or the oblong wool carder bee, and the Inthidium manicatum European wool carder bee are both unfortunately invasive. They were brought over completely by accident, probably on a shipping container. If you have a small nest, you have some eggs that survived and kind of are able to reproduce. Sometimes we get those hitchhikers. So you might see them, and they can be a problem, these wool carder bees, because they are somewhat aggressive to other bees and are kind of territorial of their nest to other bees. Not really an issue for us humans. They realize that we're not a bee, but just something to keep in mind. And here in Illinois, we have them both. So you might have these that you might see in your backyard. So moving on to the andrenids. So Andrenidae is also known as the mining bees or also as digging bees. And so these guys have thick, very dense hairs on their back legs. So if you take a look at this photo I got here a few weeks ago at the Ballard Nature Center, there is a very kind of thick, dense hair. I jokingly call these the boots with the fur bees. If you were around in 2007 and know the song I'm talking about, they just have very, very thick, dense hairs where they pack pollen onto. And being mining bees, they are pretty much all living in the ground. Um, and they're often very stoutly built, helps them dig. And it looks like they have that very dense hair because instead of just having their pollen collecting hairs on their tibia, kind of in the middle ish of their back legs, they also have those hairs on the basal segments of their legs. So, kind of if I had to uh, kind of think of us in human terms, not only are their kind of shins and knees fuzzy like they would, their ankles are also really fuzzy. They've just got a lot more hair, and they're really able to pack that pollen on. So I've got a couple of different photos that I got out and about, and these are not my specialty in identification, but I see that top left one was on some great plants that were near some of my honeybee hives. That top right one is on a malus, some sort of crabapple tree. The bottom left was on some, I believe it was tansy actually, that I found. Um, and then that bottom right one I caught in midair. So I don't know what she was after, but I let her go after I took a photo of her. One interesting thing about these mining bees too is that they actually have no kleptoparasites. So there are actually no cuckoo bees that will lay their egg in their nest and parasitize these bees. Most other families do have nest parasites. So that's just a fun fact. And so in Illinois, we have about 55, 60 species of these mining bees that you might be able to see out and about. Many of them are kind of early emerging, just like with the leafcutter bees, had I not mentioned. So all of these bees are kind of living at specific times to try to get to their specific flowers that they're interested in that have their complete nutritional source. And so most bees are only living 1 year. And they're only living a year, mostly actually as a pre-pupae in that last larval stage where they're kind of like a fat, gooey worm looking thing. They're spending a lot of time to develop. They're really only an adult for a few weeks, maybe a few months, and then they will lay their eggs and die. These bees are not going to really be around for more than a year in total, but we humans are not going to be seeing them for more than maybe 2 to 3 months. And those times will differ. So, for instance, that bee I saw on some grapes, I caught it, I believe it was in May a couple of years ago. In the top right, that one on the crabapple flowers, I believe I caught her in April, is when I took that photograph. So they're coming out at different times. And so you may or may not see these mining bees, may or may not see the leafcutter bees. Leafcutter bees are very early emergers, very early spring in general in our area of Illinois, statewide, that is. So, just a heads up when you're looking for these guys, you'll want to take into account the season because you may not see certain bee families if you're in kind of the wrong season in the wrong month. Oh, and one note, they are usually a medium to a small size. And so when I say that, I'm thinking about a large bee is probably going to be 2 centimeters or more. Medium to small is might be 1 centimeter or less. So they're going to be yay big if you don't have a ruler. So, next family I have are the halictids. These are known as the sweat bees. And they are known as such because occasionally they will be attracted to your sweat because there are some nice salts and small bits of nutrition in there for those tiny bees. So, they might land on you and lick your sweat without biting you or hurting you in any other way. That one in the bottom right hand corner, I have a photo of. That is my hand. And I found that tiny little bee for reference of the size. These bees are small. That kind of shadow you see in the bottom right is my knuckle. So this knuckle is kind of where that bee is positioned so you can tell how small she is. Um, the sweat bees are usually metallic. A lot of people will mistake them for flies, I've found. They're often green gold, the ones that we have here, and you can see that agapostamon that we have in the top left-hand corner, a photo I took in Urbana, agapostamon virescens. I believe that's the two-colored or the striped sweat bee, so called because it has this beautiful emerald green kind of upper body, and then its abdomen, its lower body is yellow and black striped. But many of these bees, you can see this one's kind of a green gold in that top right corner. And on the bottom left hand corner, it's really a blue black. And then on the bottom right hand corner, the one on my hand is kind of a metallic black green. So these are really going to be a kind of metallic bee. And they're often very small. Some of them can be medium sized, those agapostamon, the emerald bright colored ones. But generally, most of these are going to be tiny. They are actually, this family is the second most speciose bee family worldwide. Many of them will nest in the ground, but some of them will nest in wood. Um, One interesting fun fact is that there are alkali bees out west that will actually nest in some salt saturated oils, and or soils, sorry, not oils. And they are really important pollinators of alfalfa. So out in kind of Utah, New Mexico, out west, we wouldn't see them here. Halictids are also interesting because even though I'd said the vast majority of bees are solitary, some of the halictids do have kind of small, primitively eusocial colonies. And I say primitively because there's kind of different degrees of bee sociality when we are thinking about evolution of sociality. And so those colonies are really not going to hit more than 100 individuals. 50 might be about common for some of those sweat bee hives or colonies, but there's also many, many of them that are solitary. So here in Illinois, we've got about 40 species of these bees. So if you see one darting around and you think it might be a very shiny fly, take a second look. It might be a sweat bee. All right. And then caletids. So caletids are known also as the plaster bees, sometimes also known as polyester bees. And that is because they line their nests with a sort of clear, plasticky kind of substance that they make. And line their nests with. One note, there's only two genera that are common in Illinois. And so those are going to be the Hylaeus masked bees and the Caletes plaster bees. And so I'll turn that laser pointer on. So here we've got a masked bee, and they're called as such because they've got this kind of little yellow face here. It almost looks like a mask. One note, it can be very, very difficult to see these bees because they are tiny. They're some of the smallest bees we have. So if you look at that photo, that is slightly blurry because I had to zoom all the way in for you to be able to even register that that's a bee. You can see that the anthers of the pollen are there. So if you can kind of see that this bee is kind of the size of one of these flower anthers, and that was a Asian anemone flower, I think. Believe that's a photo I took at the University of Illinois Japan House in Urbana. So that's just one note that masked bee, you may or may not see them. They're very fast flyers. They kind of fly like a bullet, is how I've heard them described, because they kind of tuck their limbs into their body. A lot of other bees will kind of leave their legs hanging, but they kind of dart very quickly, and they're very small. Those Calides plasterer bees, you will see very early in the spring. So they're pretty much the first bees that I see out and about. Um, and are great pollinators of some of our early spring wildflowers, like the cut leaf toothwort, is what this guy is on. And one note, most of them are solitary, but they will sometimes live in nesting aggregations, which means they basically live in little bee apartments of a sort. If you think of, if you've been to an apartment building or a condominium, you might have one common door you go into, and there's a hallway with separate apartments or condos. With different people living there, it's kind of like that. They might have this nest where they have one entrance that goes down, and then they have separate bees in kind of little apartments or condos off of that one kind of structure going into the ground. So we only have 17 species of Calidids here in Illinois, and they're pretty much all in the Hylaeus or Calides genera. And so, some advice for looking for bees, because it definitely is a skill that I've learned and developed over 10 years. Step one, I'd say, is practice finding them. And this is a great excuse to kind of slow down, just watch some flowers, take in the nice weather and the sun, and just kind of look around and listen. Step two, practice observing them, because as you start to kind of look for bees, looking at flowers, looking at potential nesting materials, and when you start to find them, start to observe them. How do they fly? What are they eating? How are they eating? Are they fast? Are they slow? Because different bees do have different behaviors, and it can be really fun to kind of see their almost personalities, really. And step three, I say practice spot the same, which is the game I tell when it's a game that I tell my first graders or kind of younger kids that we'll play when we are trying to identify insects. You're looking for things that are similar. And by that, I mean, when you are practicing, you're looking at bees over and over, you'll start to recognize patterns. After a while, it'll become easier after you've seen maybe like 100 honeybees for you to be able to tell, oh, that's a honeybee and not a mining bee, or that is a eastern bumblebee, and this is actually a carpenter bee. Practicing being outside, looking for them, and kind of developing your pattern recognition, that's really what I mean by spot the same, can be a great way to kind of be able to see the bees around your environment. And of course, be kind to yourself, pun intended, always. It can be hard to try to find bees. A lot of times, I've started to identify bees sometimes by listening and being able to hear them buzzing. Because, again, through 10 years of practice, doing all of these three steps and building my pattern recognition, I have learned to be able to kind of hear that some bees, like bumblebees, sound different than honeybees to me. And so, again, if there's something that you love and something you're interested in, just keep at it and you will build those skills. Make sure that you're having fun while you're doing that. And so, with that, my last slide here is a pop quiz, everyone's favorite. So, I have these 5 photos, and there are 5 different bee families here, the 5 that we covered. I will count off 30 seconds, and then I will go to the hint slide. So maybe if you can jot down on notepad, on a scrap of paper or something, see if you have learned anything while you're here with me. All right, another 10 seconds with no hints. 3, 2, 1. Okay. Now, here are your hints because it is really hard to tell things without photos or seeing things in real life. So, number one, your hint here is that there is a very, very fuzzy butt, fuzzy underside of the abdomen. Number two is large and very fuzzy all over the body. Number three, kind of stout with very hairy back legs. Number four, the very shiny metallic green. Number five, very hard to tell without dissecting the nest, which I have not done, but there's a clear nest lining. So I will give you 5 seconds to finalize your answers. 3, 2, 1. So answers here. Uh, Number one is a megachilid, so a leafcutter bee, because of that fuzzy butt, the fuzzy underside of the abdomen. Number two is a two-spotted bumblebee. You can tell because there are these kind of, it almost looks like there's two spots of black because there's only a partial yellow segment here. And that is the Apidae family. Number three, those hairy back legs that with that stout body means that it's an andrenid or a mining bee. Number four, being very shiny and metallic, that is a halictid sweat bee. Number five, with a clear nest lining, is the Calides genus. That is the Caletidae, those polyester bees. And so hopefully you learned something. If you're interested in learning more, here are some resources that I recommend. Of course, you can go to pollinators.illinois.edu, the pollinator website. There are some pages that have pollinator habitat design, some plants that pollinators use. It's sorted with our different pollinators. Not only bees, but butterflies, beetles, and flies. And so definitely check that out. I did help develop some of the pages. iNaturalist is a great community science application and website. If you're interested in kind of learning more about bee identification, some of my two most recommended books are really Common Bees of Eastern North America and The Bees in Your Backyard. Both are by Olivia Messenger Carroll and Joe Wilson. And they're both fantastic researchers. The one on the right, Common Bees of Eastern North America, is the best field guide we have to our native bees. There is a Western North America component, or separate field guide if you want to purchase that one while you're out west. The Bees in Your Backyard, which I have handy at my desk pretty much always, talks a little bit more about biology, and it has just beautiful full color photos. And I use this, being a nerd, as a coffee table book in my house just to flip through because of how many beautiful photos there are in it. So if you want to see any other, oh, there we go. My click wasn't working. You're welcome to view past recordings of Four Seasons webinars at go.illinois.edu/Four Seasons recordings. So this presentation will be up there eventually once we have closed captioned them. It'll also be on YouTube. And before I end and take questions, one note, I would be super appreciative if you would be willing to fill out a survey. It lets us know if people do actually want to hear about bees, or people are like, I've heard Sri Lakshmi talk about bees 12 times. Who cares? It keeps us being able to do these sorts of webinars. So would love you to scan that QR code or go to go.illinois.edu/native dash bees and fill out that survey. That would be super helpful for me. And with that, I'm happy to take some questions.